If you're in the process of immigrating to Canada, you may have the question of when do you become subject to the Canadian tax laws? When do you need to start filing tax returns? Hi, I'm Sunny Weiderman from Personal Tax Advisors. We often get this question from people who are in the process of immigrating to Canada, particularly once they've received their permanent resident status, as to what are their tax obligations to Canada, when do they have to start filing returns. In particular, if you have not yet settled in Canada, you have this immigration status of permanent resident, but you haven't settled here yet, you're usually not subject to Canadian tax laws. The Canadian tax system is based on residency. But the confusing thing about that term is that the immigration portion of the government uses that term one way, and the tax portion of the government uses it to mean something else. So from a tax perspective, if you have your status as a permanent resident, but you don't live here, chances are you're not considered a resident for tax purposes, or a tax resident. And until you become a tax resident, you don't really have any filing obligations here. So what is tax residency? Well, in its simplest form, tax residency is where do you normally live? For most people, that's a pretty easy question to answer. It's basically where is your home, where's your bedroom, where's your kitchen, where's your bathroom, whatever you reside in, wherever that is located, that's where you are resident. There are cases where that's not as clear cut. There are people serving in the armed forces, for example, who may not be residing in Canada physically at the moment, but they're deemed resident in Canada anyway. That's a special situation similar to diplomats. They also are deemed resident in Canada. But assuming you're neither of those, if you're just not yet living in Canada, but you have your immigration status, if you're not living in Canada, you're not a tax resident at this moment. Where this gets complicated is where it's not exactly clear where you reside. For example, if you spend a lot of time in multiple countries, which one is your home country? This can be actually difficult to determine. The way the Canada Revenue Agency does it is the first thing they look at is what they call significant residential ties. The significant ties essentially are you and your spouse and your dependent minor children. Where do they live? Where do you and they live? If you all live together in one place, that would typically be the determining factor as to where you are a tax resident from the Canadian tax perspective. If you all live outside of Canada, you're not a tax resident of Canada. Things can get confusing though if there's a split. So if you are living in one place and your spouse and dependent minor children are living somewhere else, well then it's not quite as clear. Or if you spend a lot of your time in one country and a lot of your time here in Canada and then a lot of your time somewhere else, where do you draw the line and what really determines that? There can be determining factors, like if you spend more than 183 days in Canada, obviously that is more than half the year. If you're not spending more time in another country, that this could be the determining factor. But really there are some situations where it's not at all clear which country is your home country based on just your significant ties. And when that happens, then the Canada Revenue Agency, which is our tax agency, goes on down the line and they start looking at your secondary residential ties. Secondary residential ties can be things like a driver's license, a passport, even a gym membership, a library card. Basically, where are your social ties? So you may not have a clear-cut residence here in Canada, but if your less significant ties, your secondary ties are more to Canada than to anywhere else, that might be a determining factor in that kind of situation. Now, if having looked at the basic significant ties, you, your spouse, your dependent minor children, and your secondary ties, it's still not totally clear where you're residing, one thing that you can do, and you can either request a ruling or the Canadian Tax Agency, the CRA, can instead ask that you get a ruling. And what will happen then is you'll fill out a form called NR 74, which basically is a questionnaire about your life, looking at various aspects of where you normally live to determine where your strongest ties lie and whether those ties are here in Canada. Once the Canada Revenue Agency makes a ruling based on that form, that stands, and that is your residency from their perspective, unless you appeal successfully. Until you are considered to be a tax resident of Canada, Canada, either because you consider yourself to be a tax resident of Canada or because the Canada Revenue Agency has decided you're a tax resident of Canada. There's nothing to file until that happens. Once you are a tax resident of Canada, our season is in the spring, where you file the prior year's return. If you arrive in Canada in a given year, from the point that you make Canada your home, you will have to file a tax return starting on that day, covering from that day till December 31st. That will be your first tax return in Canada. If you don't arrive on January 1st, your first tax return in Canada will actually be a part year return covering the moment that you made Canada your home to December 31st, and that will be due in spring of the following year. So if you've just arrived in Canada with your family this year, there's nothing you need to really file in terms of a Canadian tax return yet, but near the beginning of next year, it'll be time to gather your information together and to either prepare your own return or, as many Canadians opt to do, hire a professional like us here at Personal Tax Advisors to put your return together for you and file that first tax return as a newcomer Canadian. I hope this has helped clarify your obligations in terms of the Canadian tax system. If it has, please give me a like and subscribe. Hit the notification bell to find out when I put out my next video. I'm always putting out new videos to help demystify the Canadian tax system, both for established Canadians and for newcomer Canadians, and I hope that you'll find them useful and approachable. I'm Sunny Weiderman from Personal Tax Advisors, and I hope to see you in the next one.